directly where Truro is.
Right.
It's almost like in your face.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I should like to convene this meeting of the New York State DNA Subcommittee. And firstly, I should like to welcome members of the subcommittee and guests. Let it be known for the record that we have a quorum today, and the members present are Drs. Carmody, Batser, Chakraborty, and our new member, Dr. Buell, and myself, Dr. Valentine. Two members are absent, so we have a quorum this morning. So the first item on the agenda is for the committee to review and approve, if possible, the meeting agenda. So we have in front of us a draft agenda. So if the committee would like to look through that and decide whether...
I move that it be accepted.
Second. Any further discussion? All those in favour of proceeding with the agenda as drafted, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, we can proceed. So the next thing on the agenda is the minutes from the last meeting from May 19th, 2010. And again, the committee has a copy of the draft meeting minutes from May 19th. So we've had an opportunity perhaps to have seen it prior to coming here, but I'll give you a few moments to look at it again if necessary.
Jack, may I make one change to that?
There's a proposed change, yes?
Yeah, it's. I wasn't there, but I'm actually from the Vermont Forensic Laboratory, not the State Police Forensic Laboratory. Okay.
The Vermont
Forensic Laboratory. Okay.
Forensic Laboratory.
Yeah, and you're no longer part of the State Police.
Okay.
Small change, but significant.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Propose approval of the minutes?
Of the amendment.
Of the amendment.
Of the amended minutes, yeah.
Second. Any discussion? All those in favour of accepting these the amended minutes, say aye.
Aye.
All committee members voted yes to accept these amended minutes. Okay, the next item on the agenda is called New Business, and there are a couple of laboratories, Nassau County and subsequently Erie County, where there's going to be some discussion on accreditation and ASCAD lab issues, as well as the CODIS issues. And so the first laboratory is Nassau County Medical Examiner's Office. Kathy, do you want to lead the discussion, or?
I think I'll let it turn it over to Karen Dooling, the assistant.
We have Karen Dooling here from the Nassau County Medical Examiner's Office, and Karen will give us will discuss the contents of the...
Good morning. So you have a couple of letters. The last time we were here, we had discussed that the FBI had denied our appeal, and it was the same for ASCAD Lab. So you have a letter that indicates what our corrective action would be in there. And at this point, we have submitted the corrective action. Our lead assessor has said it was acceptable, and they're going to vote on our accreditation this coming Tuesday. That is just as of this morning. So I guess any questions?
Are you on the agenda?
We are on the agenda for
the
Tuesday
October
for
call.
accreditation to be voted on by ASCAD Lab International Program.
Can I ask a
Yes.
question? Karen, I'm just a little confused. And I'm looking at your letter of August 26, 2010, and it says the laboratory will no longer use, cannot be excluded. So, and then it makes reference to some policy. Would you mind going over that policy and what your laboratory reports would look like?
The remediation was just submitted to them yesterday. I'd be glad to briefly go over it, but it will be in your packets for the next time you meet. We will not be using the cannot be excluded statement anymore. We have really revised the way we do business and the way we write reports. We will use included, when we can, and use either the random match probability or the CPI. And I guess that kind of sums it up. But you'll be getting all these flow charts and
So with each report then, some statistical measurement of weight to that will be included in the report,
that's correct.
whereas before it was not, as I understand it.
Well, the only issue was the cannot be excluded statement that we were using, where we were not providing statistical weight when there was an association to an individual, which we will now be doing, but we won't even be using that statement anymore. If it's inconclusive, we'll note that it's inconclusive with one of 3 or 4 reasons why. Like maybe due to the mixture ratio, due to insufficient data, so we'll be indicating why.
Okay.
But the cannot exclude was only used in a small percentage of cases anyway to begin with, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's actually what took some of the time to build the cases, because it was really, I mean, maybe 1% of our caseload. We were actually saving them for after the policy was in place. It was not a large percentage of our caseload.
Okay. So the issue regarding the ENDIS issue, was there an issue with ENDIS as well?
The other item that you have on your agenda is in 2008, and ENDIS and the FBI started doing CODIS, informal CODIS audits or assessments. We were the first laboratory in the nation to undergo one of these.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it was basically because of our close proximity to New York City that landed us the assessment. There were 3 issues. The one was regarding administrative removals versus expungements. We did not define them correctly as indicated by them, although we were removing profiles when they needed to be removed. The definitions weren't quite what they were supposed to be, so we remediated that, as you can see. The second issue was that our backup tapes were not stored in a lockable container, although they were on simplex, key card secure access within the laboratory. They felt that that wasn't sufficient, so they're now in a locked filing cabinet. And the third was that 5 ineligible profiles were found of the 20 or so that they decided to look at, and they were determined to be ineligible for CODIS, so they were removed. These were all older profiles prior to the issue of the ENDIS guidelines for profiles in ENDIS, so no surprise that there were a few. And we also changed our policy to move forward, that when we do have a match, we also reevaluate on older cases. We reevaluate whether that profile is ENDIS eligible or not, and all the profiles in that case to expunge anything that might not be. They found that acceptable.
Okay. Any further questions or comments? No. Thank you, Karen. I think in this case there's no need for a vote or anything. This is just for information purposes only. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
So the other laboratory is the Erie County Central Police Services Lab.
And there's no one from Erie County here today. They didn't feel it was the distance from New York City, and with their budget constrictions, they couldn't kind of make it to this meeting. And I did not think that they needed to be on for the telephone conference, but if you have any questions for them, we could certainly, I think they'll be on for an audit for the next meeting. But we can always defer any questions to them, but I apologize for that.
Questions or comments? There's a letter from the FBI, from Doug Hayes, August 18th, saying that a review of the assessment documentation found the lab to be in compliance with federal law. So obviously, all these factors have also been deemed resolved according to the FBI.
Right.
seems like things are in order, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Okay, Julie noted that.
These are the first times we've had these INDUS assessments, so
Yes.
they're here for your information. And, you know, if you have any further questions, we can always let the lab know.
Yes, I think it's a question for the committee that this was the first time the INDUS. So normally we get the quality assurance audits from the labs as part of the accreditation, but we haven't seen the INDUS type of documents. So would it be useful for us to at least review some of these INDUS documents? Because obviously part of our duties are of course to oversee not only the caseworking side but the database side as well. So do you think it's appropriate that we do continue to get these documents?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's good.
I will let the lab directors know.
Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, the next item on the agenda is continuation of the discussion by the New York City OCME of the validation of the forensic statistical tool for criminal casework. And Dr. Cara Jane from OCME is going to give us a presentation.
So thank you for inviting us back today. It's a pleasure to be here. Today we're going to talk about our final validation of our forensic statistical tool. And I first just would like to acknowledge Dr. Adele Mitchell, who's responsible for all of the development. And I'm here today just to give what our final validation results are and how we plan to implement these in forensic casework. Next slide.
Did you want to do it? I can do it if you want.
We can.
You might want to switch sides.
I can do it. I'll you do it.
I'll do it.
Right over here. Okay, so we're going to go through how we do mixture analysis very briefly. We're going to review some of the materials that we have previously provided to the subcommittee. And then we're going to focus in on the additional work that we have performed that was requested by the subcommittee, with a focus on analysis of true contributors to mixtures and also analysis of non-contributors to mixtures. And lastly, we'll talk about how we will interpret this likelihood ratio value. So when we do mixture analysis at the OCME, we always, if possible, attempt to deconvolute or deduce the mixture and attempt to get a major or a minor contributor's profile. When we have a major or minor contributor's profile, we do random match probability. When we have mixtures that we cannot deconvolute, then we cannot use the random match probability. Or if we have a mixture that we can deconvolute the major but not the minor, but the mixture is suitable for comparison to the minor, then we also cannot do random match probability, and we have a need for statistics.
One comment. Likelihood ratio is also a statistic, so you should put alternative statistic.
Alternate, yes, that's correct. So some of the suggested strategies for statistics include the combined probability of inclusion, or the CPI, and this can be used if all of the comparison samples alleles are seen in the evidence. It cannot be used if any of the comparison samples alleles are missing or unlabeled, or if there's dropout. So in other words, dropout cannot be modeled with the CPI. However, you can do that with the likelihood ratio. So the likelihood ratio is a universally used statistic. It's based on Bayesian analysis. In forensics, basically the random match probability is a likelihood ratio. The CODIS PopStat software performs mixture analysis using the LR. LR is used for kinship analysis, and allele drop out and drop in can both be modeled in the LR framework. So next slide. So at the because to do the calculation of likelihood ratios, modeling dropout and drop in is so complex and cumbersome, you need to do software. And currently there is no commercially available software to do so. So at the OCME, we began developing and we have validated what we are terming the forensic statistical tool. And this is otherwise known as FST. So FST can incorporate empirically determined drop-in and locus-specific drop-out values for both deducible and non-deducible mixtures. So we empirically determined what a dropout value would be for a range of different quants from 25 picograms up to 50. Specifically, we did 50, 100, 150, 250, and 500, and 25. And if we have a quantity of DNA that's amplified that is an in-between value, such as 75 picogram, the program can then interpolate to find the dropout value that is appropriate. Next slide. So previously, we provided many materials. We were here in November 2009, and there we presented our analytical method. And if there's further questions on that, we'd be happy to entertain them. In March 2010, we showed dropout and drop-in data, and we also proposed our validation plan. In May 2010, we gave you a validation progress report, and today we are presenting our final validation results that you hopefully have received. And these have all been reviewed by our technical leader, Eugene Lean. So specifically what we have presented previously, in November 2009, we talked about the conceptual basis of the program. We gave you some preliminary drop-in and drop-out data, and we worked through some examples with screenshots of what the program looks like. In March, we gave additional dropout and drop-in data for over 2,000 samples, and this is the data that the program is using. And we also presented our validation plan. Next slide, please. And in May 2010, we gave you a write-up of what the statistical methods were, and these were also enclosed in the materials, the different PDF entitled reference materials that were forwarded to you this September. We also gave a program logic and computational flowchart, so how the program works out the math. Also, Adele did many manual calculations to verify the program and to show that the interpolation is working. These were done by hand and then checked. We gave us our user's manual, how our analysts will use the software. And we also showed how we tested for the independence of the dropout rates among the loci. Next slide, please. So in May, we also presented our study design. So for our study, all of our samples were processed according to how we do casework at the OCME. So if we made a purposeful 3-person mixture, but it appeared to be a 2-person mixture, it was run in the program as a 2-person mixture. We followed our casework protocols. And we followed our casework protocols to determine whether or not the mixture was deducible or not. Next slide, please. All of the comparisons were done manually, as we do them now, and also were evaluated with the FST software. The samples were compared in May to a database of 500 non-contributors. And we also looked at the effect of including a victim's profile in the likelihood ratio. Next slide. In May, we also presented our casework implementation plan. So how are we going to use this in casework? Well, we're still going to use random match probability for all deduced profile. So if we get a major profile, we're going to use the RMP. But when we have a mixture that we cannot deduce, we will use the FST software, the likelihood ratio, instead of CPI. And also, when we have a major profile, but a known sample is not consistent with the major, but we're looking to see if he or she could be a minor contributor to the mixture, we will then use the FST software. So just to continue on what we also presented in May, we showed that the FST software is reproducible. We looked at many repeated searches. For example, we looked at 282 instances where a single search, where we compared a suspect directly to the mixture, gave the same likelihood ratio as when we compared our database, which included the suspect's profile. So we have our full database of 500, and we also, in that database, entered our suspects with the mixture. And the likelihood ratios gave the same value 100% of the time. We showed that our program is sensitive because we tested a range of template amounts. And we showed concordance between the LR value and our manual conclusions. Next slide. So at that time in May, you asked us to do some additional work. This was to do more 3-person mixtures, to evaluate a degraded module for degraded samples. And as a bonus, we also increased our database size from 500. And all of the samples that we ran previously, we reran through the program. So next slide. Additional work was also performed on the likelihood ratio distribution for non-contributors. However, at this time, adequately fitting curves were not obtained. So therefore, this will not be implemented in casework. So next slide. So what exact additional work did we do? Well, we made 285 more touched and purposeful mixtures, which represents a 2.5 times increase over the data that we showed you last time. Specifically, we did 117 more two-person mixtures, 75% increase, and we did 168, more three-person mixtures, which is a 5 times increase on our past data. We ran over 460,000 comparisons more with non-contributors. And it's pretty evenly spread between, we have over 260,000 comparisons with non-contributors for two-person mixtures and over 200,000 more comparisons with three-person mixtures. So that's a 14 times increase from the data that we showed you before. So in all, we've run over 500,000 comparisons with non-contributors. So next slide, please. So specifically, we've run 480 samples against the database, and these were comprised of 439 mixtures. The discrepancy there is that we ran some of the mixtures, both deduced and non-deduced, because the mixture ratio was very close. So we wanted to check out how things were done. And for casework, if we do deduce a sample, we're going to run it deduced. And these mixtures were composed of different combinations of 85 donors. And specifically, there were 272 two-person and 208 three-person. And these were pretty evenly distributed between high template DNA samples and low template DNA samples. And keeping in mind that we define low template as any sample that's amplified in each replicate with less than 100 picograms. So next slide, please. So this is just a box plot to demonstrate to you the distribution of the amount of DNA amplified for all of the samples tested. And the last time we were here, Adele showed box plots and you had asked what the whiskers mean. And so here's a definition, and it means the maximum whisker length is 1.5 times the interquartile range. And so observations that lie more than 1.5 times the interquartile range beyond the 25th or 75th percentile, these are represented by the circles in the graph. Next slide. So just to talk a bit more about the types of samples that we tested. So 89 of the mixtures were from touched items. So donors in the laboratory would handle an item, it would be swabbed, processed according to casework protocols, and then analyzed. And specifically, there were 53 two-person and 36 three-person mixtures. Now, we tried to make many, many more three-person mixtures, but oftentimes they just looked like two-person, just because maybe the way the other person's picking up their DNA. We ran 257 purposeful non-degraded mixtures. There's 121 two-person and 136 three-person mixtures. And we also ran 93 purposeful mixtures that were degraded. We degraded these with UVC irradiation for 30 seconds, and they showed a pattern of degradation. Next slide. Then we tested our degraded module with these purposely degraded mixtures and with many of the touched items, because many of the touched items appeared degraded. And the degraded module for these samples sometimes improved the likelihood ratio, but it also raised the likelihood ratio for the non-contributors. So because this non-degraded module, because it has a higher dropout rate, because the non-degraded module is more conservative for degraded samples than using the degraded module, we will not use the degraded module for casework.
Exactly what do you mean by conservative in this case? It means that you would tend to exclude somebody?
Well, we were considering conservative in that the non-contributors, we would have more fortuitous associations using the degraded module. So the separation wasn't as good. So further investigation of the purposeful mixtures that we ran, we used these to verify our dropout rates. So 162 mixtures were tested with ratios that are less extreme, not more extreme, that's a typo, I apologize, than the dropout rates that FST uses. So if you have a two-person deduced sample, the dropout rates that are used are the dropout of the minor contributor in a 4-to-1 or the minor in a 5-to-1-to-1 mixture. So if you had a purposeful 3-to-1-to-1 mixture, you may see less dropout than the dropout rate that FST is using. So we wanted to check specifically these less extreme ratios. So we ran 130 of those where those ratios were made up after quantitation right before AMP. And these 32 samples were made up they were blood punches taken in 4:1 ratios and then extracted, so they didn't come out quite at 4:1. This wasn't a concern for our non-deducible mixtures. The dropout used for those are 1:1 or 1:1. So if something was a little more extreme, the FST would be use a more conservative rate. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about how our validation worked out with testing of known contributors. Next slide. So all of our manual comparisons were done strictly according to our current OCME protocols, and all of our positive associations were supportive. So we are now characterizing our known contributors. So we have about 322 where we would say he could be the major contributor or he could be a contributor included. These are for two-person mixtures. 114 where we would say that he cannot be excluded, meaning that one allele may not be seen in the mixture, but the absence of that allele can be explained. There were 54 comparisons between a contributor and the mixture where we couldn't draw any conclusion. There just wasn't enough information to support a positive association or an exclusion. And there were 119 instances where we would say that contributor could have been excluded. And this is the formula that the FST is using for that. It's the two-person comparison. Next slide, please. So here is a box plot showing what these results are. So here is for if our known sample was characterized as included or as a major contributor. They cannot be excluded, a CBE. No conc stands for no conclusions, and excluded is on your right. And on the left are for deducible mixtures, and on the right are for non-deducible mixtures. So these circles represent some outliers. So next slide, please. So what happened with these outliers? So for the samples where we manually called them cannot be excluded, where we would see one or two alleles missing, but we could explain the absence of that allele, some of these, very few, came out with a low LR. So what happened? Well, first note, none of these were from the touched items. These for two-person mixtures were all from the purposeful mixtures. And in all cases, the contributor that we were comparing it to was used to make the mixture. So that positive association was supported. But these characteristics were for the ones that were low template. When we're doing a manual comparison, if the locus does not have any repeating alleles, we're not using that in our manual comparison. That locus is deemed inconclusive. But the FST uses all alleles that are labeled in all three replicates. So perhaps it wasn't repeating or it didn't show up there. For the high template DNA sample, we may have deemed a sample cannot be excluded because we saw one allele not labeled, but it was visible below threshold. The program doesn't know it's not labeled. It just knows what's labeled. So when the data come off GeneMapper or Genotyper, everything's labeled. It doesn't get touched. That would go into the program. It's just whatever comes off the machine labeled, that's what the program uses. Next slide, please. So with all of these profiles, the FST was being more conservative than our qualitative assessments were. Next slide, please. There were, I believe it was 2 samples where we had deemed them excluded, but the FST gave a likelihood ratio that was greater than 1. And again, these were all known contributors. And the characteristics of these, we would have seen for low template DNA samples, we have a very stringent manual comparison protocol. If 3 alleles or more are not labeled, we would either say no conclusions or excluded. So some of these samples had 4 or more alleles not labeled, and they may have had a very low quantity of DNA, such as 25 picograms in the mixture. So they truly were, we knew we made the mixtures up, a contributor to the mixture, but manually, there just wasn't enough information there for us to manually, without the aid of software, make an association. And the same thing for a high template sample. It was on the low range of the high template side. There was 150 picograms. So we were just being more conservative with our qualitative assessments there just because there wasn't enough info. Next slide, please. So the 3-person mixtures. So now we're comparing our known contributors to those that were run with the 3-person module. And we had 331 that were either major contributors or included. And note, in real casework, if we had a suspect that was consistent with our major contributor, we would do RMP. We wouldn't run it, but we were running it for the program, for this test. We had 104 comparisons where we deemed them cannot be excluded, 44 no conclusions, and 54 excluded. And the results were similar. The next slide, please. Again, we just have a few outliers, and so here is included, cannot be excluded, no conclusion, and excluded for our deducible mixtures and our non-deducible. And this is a pool of 533 comparisons, and for the two-person, there were 609 comparisons. And there were very few outliers. It was mainly the same scenarios, perhaps that alleles were not repeating, but we would only see them once, and if it wasn't repeating, the FST might have given it a lower LR value. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what testing we did with non-contributors, people that from the database who did not contribute. And these are likelihood ratio, these are population distributions of log likelihood ratio values for the two-person samples. On the left are deducible mixtures, and on the right are non-deducible mixtures. And these are each over 160,000 comparisons. And this was an attempt at the best fit for here. And as you can see, it still doesn't satisfy Dr. Mitchell, so we're not going to be using that best fit that we were discussing at the last meeting. Next slide, please. So this table gives you a graph of how often did we see LRs, particularly those that are greater than 1, in our population of non-contributors, and we know that they did not contribute to the sample. So for example, how often did we see an LR greater than 10 for a non-contributor? In deducible two-person mixtures, we saw an LR greater than 10, 1 in 16,000 times, and in non-deducible, 1 in 19,000 times. And when we looked closely at all of the non-contributors who would show positive LRs, they truly were fortuitous comparisons. They just shared alleles. Next slide, please. So these are the population distributions of the log LRs for three-person mixtures. And for deducible three-person, there are 93,700 comparisons. And for non-deducible, there are over 121,000 comparisons. And I don't think I mentioned we had increased our database to over 1,200 non-contributors. So that's how these numbers went up. And again, Dr. Mitchell wasn't happy with the curve fitting, so we're not doing that P-curve fit. Next slide, please.
I mean, they look pretty good fits to me, but you did statistically.
But on the high
on that
end,
end.
on the high end where we're really concerned, you know, where we're trying to get a
The middle
value.
is all right, only in the tail.
And these are tighter, these were better than the two-person, they fit better, but still, they're drastic underestimates of the frequency of those high values.
But we may not give up.
We might not give up,
Right
because
now.
at this point, we don't have a good.
And so here's a table showing how often did we see a likelihood ratio, for example, greater than 1 in our population of non-contributors. So for a three-person mixture, for a likelihood ratio greater than 10, for deducible mixtures, it would be 1 in 4,400, and non-deducible 1 in 7,600. So always with the non-deducible module, it's more rare because there's a lower dropout rate that it allows. So next slide. So then when we had this likelihood ratio number that we would present in our reports and in court, we asked ourselves now for casework, how would we give some significance to this value? So we refer to Dr. Butler's book, Forensic DNA Typing, and he has a table on there. And when it reads here, if the likelihood ratio is, for example, between 100 and 1,000, then the evidence provides strong support. If it's greater than 1,000, the evidence provides very strong support. But if it's only between 1 and 10, that is very limited support. And this was concordance when we looked at all of our results, when we knew that, in hindsight, we would know the answer, and this supported that. So next slide, please.
I'd be almost inclined to call that very limited support when it's 1 to 10, I don't know. I mean, I know you're following the textbook and it's all in the eyes of the beholder, but.
And this probably originally came from Ian Hevitt, I would say.
Well,
yes.
it has a longer history, it goes
Yes.
back to Hummel's
I know.
days.
Okay, with the
really wanna go
paternity
back.
index, yeah.
Another way that we can put some weight on these LRs is we can refer back to our validation studies, tables 4A and 4B in your materials, and the two tables we previously submitted to say how often did we say it. And another way Dr. Carmody had suggested to us is we can have a more specific approximation by running the evidentiary sample exactly against our database of over 1,200 non-contributors and get really an exact comparison of how often would we see a non-contributor to be just fortuitously have an LR greater than 1.
For that particular mixture.
For that particular mixture, right. That might be
Just
very
generically,
useful for
yeah.
court. No, of course, you would run that particular mixture against all the non-contributors. So to sum up, we've done over 480 samples over a range of DNA template amounts and over a range of DNA mixture ratios. We've done purposeful mixtures from blood and saliva samples, and we've done over 89 touched items. Many of these samples were purposefully degraded, or the touched items appeared degraded just naturally. And overall, we've done over 500,000 comparisons with non-contributors. Next slide. So in conclusion, we've shown that the likelihood ratio for two true contributors supports our qualitative assessments that we made manually. In some cases, excuse me, the likelihood ratio was more conservative than the qualitative assessment that we made manually. In other cases, FST provided a numerical weight for a sample for which no manual comparison could be made. Remember, we had quite a few samples, particularly in the low range, where we would just say no conclusion, and now either it gave a very negative LR or it gave a slightly positive LR. And the likelihood ratio showed a good separation between the true and the non-contributors. But of course, due to allele sharing, for some mixtures, fortuitous positive associations were noted, but the FST assigned an appropriate weight. Next slide. So in sum, we find that the FST software is a reliable statistical software which assigns quantitative weights to qualitative assessments. And of course, I want to thank, there's been so many people at the OCME that have worked on this. In particular, Dr. Mitchell, she's amazing, Dr. Prince, Dr. Budamilla has put in so much time. The team of people who made the 2,041 samples for dropout rates, G.D. Tamaris, Lauren Lieberman, Nubia Dukas, and Andrew Wong, and we lost 2 people who left through all this work. We've had a slew of interns that hopefully we won't kill. Kathleen O'Connor, Christina Masterson, Tom and Nick, just amazing, AJ and Lulu. And even people from casework helped out, everyone on the right side. And of course our programmers, and in particular Win-Win Ma, who came in at the end and picked everything up, and for not being software people, I think I'm just very grateful to
His
them.
name is very significant, Win-Win.
Yes.
better than the alternative.
Yeah.
Very good.
So, questions, comments from the committee?
A comment I have is it's nice to see the progress that's been made, and the continuing studies and the validation and so forth. It seems pretty convincing to me.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with the work. I mean, one thing that I've come here, I'm somewhat surprised to see that the non-reducible LRs are not that much smaller than the reducible ones by distribution wise.
Yeah.
And I think that is a significant feature of the conservativeness of the software computations. But less quite defendable.
And can you remind me again, that you have locus-specific dropout rates, but not locus-specific drop-in rates again. Can you remind, I know you presented this maybe earlier on, what was the reason for that again?
We found that the drop-in rates did not vary much locus to locus.
Right.
So what we're using is for high template DNA, we have a 2% per locus per replicate drop-in rate for one allele, and then 0.5% probability of 2 or more alleles. For low template, we use 3.5% for a single allele and 0.5% for 2 or more. We pretty much, we very rarely saw the 2 or more drop-ins, so that's it.
So for low template, 3.5%?
Yeah, 3.5% per locus per replicate.
Drop-in is usually specimen-specific or laboratory protocol-specific phenomenon. drop out depends on the specific sample, amplicon size, chemistry, etc.
But it's interesting that when they did the studies, they did see some differences just by sampling even.
Well, I mean,
But, yeah.
first of all, like, not in their case, in other published studies, the sample size is so sparse. I mean, you can't really depend upon the standard textbook statistics. So there, I think this result is quite interesting and.
Yeah, it seemed to be more a function of number of cycles than
Right.
locus.
And also, when you have a mixture, then what's the 5-to-1? What's the point at which you think that the program would not 5-to-1, 6-to-1? At what point does the program it wouldn't actually be able to help you very much?
Well, we do have 10-to-1 mixtures, but the minor is so gone that that's the point where we would then treat that almost as single source, or you could easily deduce it. So at that point, it's not really useful when it's so.
There were a few of the we have some 5-to-1 mixtures,
Mm-hmm.
and the one, so like 1 in 11, where those where we would say, I think one with 3-person where we said cannot be excluded, where the LR was negative or too low, or like 0.01. Log LR, sorry. So that would be too extreme. The one is that it's more conservative.
Right, when the minor is very, very minor.
The dropout rates are concentration or template dependent, right? So how does, with mixtures, how does that all play out in the program? So if you quanted a sample, you've got the total quant and it's X, and then but it's a combination of all of those. So how does a program find the right rate then based on?
If we said it was a non-deducible mixture, it would use the 1-to-1 or the 1-to-1-to-1. So for like a low template sample, we don't deduce 2-to-1 mixtures. So actually FST is being more conservative then, because there'll be less dropout in a 1-to-1 than in a 2-to-1. And so if the mixture, we deem it deducible, we're using the 4-to-1, so the minor of the 1 in 5 there, 4-to-1 mixture, and if it's a 3-person, we're doing 5-to-1-to-1. And that was why we tried those less extreme ratios, the 3-to-1s, the 3-to-1s in our test with purposeful mixtures to make sure that we weren't having outlier results there.
In practice, if we had a deducible mixture, we would deduce it, and if then a comparison sample matched the deduced profile would be done. If it didn't, and we were maybe after the minor, that's the point when we use the non-deducible module for them, and we're really truly after the minor control.
Any other comments?
Just for your information, there is a case in the Bay Area in California where defense is using, it's a mixture, and they're using drop-in and drop-out rates in their defense arguments, yes. I can get you more information about it. I was asking about that. But Nora Rudin is one of the people involved with the defense in that case. And she used some data. He's a chemist. I think he's at University of North Dakota or something like that. But they had some specific rates and so forth. And to be honest, I was asked to consult on the case, and I didn't see how this defense interpretation was helping the defense. Strange.
I'm coming in new ones, so okay, so.
Do you want to come to the table so we can make sure we get you all on the audio? Thanks.
So in your additional information that was provided, the FST validation summary that I believe you gave last time, but also a copy. It talks about in order to run this program, you need a sample from the suspect. Are all your alleles locked in before you get to that point?
Yes.
And everything?
Yes. So whatever the final labeled alleles that come off GeneMapper, that's what's used, and the labeled alleles from the suspect, that's used. Nothing's changed.
So if I were to watch you in your laboratory doing this, and once again, it's coming in late, you've run your samples, and then this data goes into the software, okay? And just walk me through, then.
Okay.
Sure. So we have actually teams in our software. We have an exemplar team that does all of our knowns. So they would take the suspect sample and they make 2 cuttings of it and get independent profiles, and then they will give us a file with the suspect's profile in there. But that's separate. The evidence gets done, and we run, if it's low template, we do it 3 times, 3 separate amplifications, and most of the high template samples are done twice. And then we get our labeled alleles out, and that would be complete, and that would go into the file. And then when we get the suspect sample in, we want to make the comparison, then we would take the labeled alleles that we previously generated from the evidence, the labeled alleles that the other team generated for the suspect, and enter those into the FST software.
Or if a deduction is done, it's
Right.
done on the evidence, before the
Before.
suspect is observed. So.
Yeah.
Right.
The labeled alleles could be any alleles that are just labeled by the instrument now, right?
Well, this is
Deduced
after,
alleles.
no,
Yeah.
okay, so after it comes off the instrument, if it's, if it's a mixture, we don't remove stutter. If it was single source, you would remove stutter. So a mixture, we would not remove stutter. And as Adele was saying, we would assess the sample and say, is it deducible or not? If it's deducible, we would attempt to deduce the major, and if it's high template, we can attempt to also deduce the minor. And then we would make our comparison. Many samples are not deducible, so those would just be mixtures for comparison.
Right. So if it's not deducible, the labeled alleles from the evidence are fed into the program, and the suspect's alleles are also go in. So there's no editing of the files after.
There's no dropping of loci or
okay.
removing of alleles.
Right.
Can I ask a
Yeah.
really basic, fundamental question from before? Just looking over at how you perform some of your analyses. You do rather long injection times. Do you find any loss in resolution of peaks with that? A 9.310 though, do you see that?
No,
If
not
any-
with you mean with the high injection for low
Right,
template
yes,
samples?
yeah.
No, I mean also everything, all the controls, every positive control and ladder gets run the same way. So if there's a problem, the ladder would fail, and then the whole injection fails. So, no, I mean it's a bit wider, but we still have resolution of the 9.310. So
Okay.
everything's. I think if we did try everything, and higher kilovolts was too much. But I've seen a lab who did 10 kilovolts. Was it 5 or the Netherlands? It was doing 10 kilovolts, which I thought was crazy, but then only 10 seconds,
Mhm.
and they said it was fine. So I guess it's the combination.
Yeah, 20 seconds seems like a long time, but if it's working well for you.
Well, the AVI default back in like 03 or 04 was 1 kilovolt 22 seconds, and then they switched it to 310, but you get exactly the same results.
Yeah,
And
okay.
maybe they switched it from community people not liking 20. I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
Anything else you want to ask?
No, go ahead. You gave me 3, I used more than
No.
3.
You can ask as many.
If you have more, ask away. Yeah.
Try to keep it to 3. You can ask any more, honestly.
Yeah.
No? Okay. Any other questions or comments from the committee? No? Because I think what we need to do is obviously there's the need to draft a resolution that will enable the OCME to put this into casework use. And we have to do this obviously by sending a binding recommendation to the Commission. So is that what we should consider doing? So I have a resolution that I just jotted down on my jot spot. And it says, the DNA Subcommittee has reviewed and evaluated the statistical forensic science tool developed by the New York City OCME, and the DNA Subcommittee offers a binding recommendation to the Commission that its use by the OCME be approved for forensic casework.
I might just throw in the acronym, Jack, just to really, so that we're clear about it.
So we actually call it the forensic
Yeah,
statistical
FST.
tool.
Okay, it's not forensic science, FST, the statistical.
Forensic
So if do you want to call it the statistical FST? No, just call it
Forensic statistical
tool. Okay.
I know it's boring.
Yeah.
It's not our strong suit.
In parenthesis, FST.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other, and I'll read this again in a second, but any other modifications? I'll read it again. Try and formulate it. Okay, the proposed resolution is that following. The DNA subcommittee has reviewed and evaluated the forensic statistical tool, parenthesis FST, developed by the New York City OCME. The DNA subcommittee offers a binding recommendation to the Commission that its use by the OCME be approved for forensic casework. So that's,
I'm good.
any second? No, let's
Second.
Dr. Chakraborty seconds. Any discussion? All those in favour of the recommendation, the binding recommendation, this motion to send this binding recommendation to the Commission, say aye.
Aye.
So unanimous decision by the committee. Thank you very much.
You're going to publish it?
Publish it.
Bill
Good,
started the draft.
good.
Can they go home early today?
So there's one thing I think that the committee would like to express our speedy. We want to express to one of the committee members who's not present, Dr. Hirsch. We would like to wish him a speedy recovery. So he's probably not listening right now, Dr. Hirsch. But if you are, we're wishing you a speedy recovery.
Pass on that.
The minutes shall reflect that.
And the minutes shall reflect that. Okay, so the last item is the next meeting date and location, and for the first time, I think, in the history of this committee, we actually have a definite date that we can actually tell
amazing.
those gathered around. The next date and location is January the 28th, 2011, in New York City. Time,
9:30.
9:30. And
Edmund, is that a Friday? Is that
Yes.
The Friday.
Yes.
so with that, I should like to thank members of the committee and all guests and presenters, and I should like to adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Infinity required Crystal Man's to do.
It's the fastest meeting we've ever had.
Good.